We're now on Daf Tes Vav, and after wishing you Chodesh Tov, Shavua Tov, let's see if we can find the place. We're up to Masiv Rav Mesharshia, which is parallel to Tosas Dibra Maskil V'Sichek. Now, there was one opinion that had it that although Beit Shammai allowed and required Yibum in the case of a Tzaras Erva, but nevertheless, Lo Asu Kidivrein. They didn't want to get involved in a possible situation in which, according to Beis Hillel, the child of such a marriage would be a mamzer. So Rav Mesharshia is going to raise an objection against that shita that lo asu Beit Shammai kidivrein from a Mishnah at the beginning of Masechet Rosh Hashanah, which, by the way, is tomorrow's Daf Yomi. And the Mishnah records a machlokus between Beit Shammai and Beis Hillel. Echad b'Shvat, Rosh Hashanah le'ilan l'divrei Beit Shammai, u'Beis Hillel omer b'chamisha sar bo. So we're more familiar with the opinion of Beis Hillel that Tu b'Shvat is Rosh Hashanah le'ilanos, as far as Maser is concerned, but Beis Shammai are of the opinion that Rosh Chodesh Shvat is Rosh Hashanah le'ilanos. Now, what's the nafkamina in terms of Maser? Halacha is that on years 1, 2, 4, and 5 of Shemitah, in addition to Maser Rishon, Maser Sheni is obligatory, whereas on years 3 and 6 of the Shemitah cycle, instead of Maser Sheni, it's Maser Oni. So if you have fruits that are growing on a tree, going into the third year, from the second to the third, and Chanota, we'll talk about Chanota later, but that is achieved during the 2-week period that falls in between Beit Shammai and Beis Hillel. That means sometime after Rosh Chodesh Shvat, but before Tu B'Shvat. Then according to Beis Hillel, you'd be obligated in Maser Ani, because you've already entered into the third year as of Rosh Chodesh Shvat. According to Rabbi Akiva, on the other hand, I'm sorry, we'll see about Rabbi Akiva in a minute. According to Beis Hillel, you still are in the second year, and you're chayav in Meiser Sheni, not Meiser Ani. Meiser Rabbi Akiva. So Rabbi Akiva had a situation that was this exact case that fell in between Beis Hillel and Beit Shammai. Shaliket esrog bi'echad b'Shvat. It was already after Shkias Hachama on Rosh Chodesh Shvat. And it's interesting that the Mishnah mentions Rabbi Akiva in terms of Lakita. With regard to Peres HaIlon, everything depends upon Chanata, not Lakita. Chanata is obviously much earlier than Lakita. However, this case is a unique case. It's a case of an esrog. And the esrog tree is very unique amongst all the trees. It has the status of a yerek, of a vegetable. All other trees, the year of the tree is determined by Rosh Hashanah Le'ilanos at the time of Lakita. I'm sorry, at the time of Chanot. The exception to the rule is esrog, because esrog, like a yerek, like a vegetable, the year of the vegetable will be determined by Lakita, by when you actually pull it out of the ground. Same thing applies when you're harvesting esrogim. It all depends upon Lakita. That's why this year's Esrogim were all shishas. None of them were shvias. Next year's Esrogim will be all shvias because their Lakita would take place during the 7th year, the Shemitah year. So Rabbi Akiva, following the halacha that equates an esrog tree with Yerakos, the Azlinan Baso Lakita, Shaliket Esrog V'Echad B'Shvat. It was the 2nd year going into the 3rd year. It was after Rosh Chodesh Shvat. According to Beit Shammai, you were chayiv in Meiser Ani. According to Beit Hillel, in Meiser Sheni. V'Noag Bo Shnei Isurim. Imagine. It's enough to ask a person to set aside 20% of his produce, 10% for the Levi and 10% for Meiser Sheni. On top to boot, he is not going to get away with Meiser Sheni. He's got to add a 3rd Maser, which is Meiser Ani, Kedas Beit Shammai, because the Lakita took place after Rosh Chodesh Shvat. 30% of his produce will have to be given away, whether it's to the Levi, whether it's to the, to Yerushalayim to take it up. And the Echad Kedivre Beis Hillel, and according to Beis Hillel, we're still, in the 2nd year, and therefore we're Chayv Meiser Sheni. So he's going to have to be Mafresh Meiser Ani Kishitas Beit Shammai and Meiser Sheni Kishitas Beis Hillel, which, by the way, in and of itself is fascinating that Rabbi Akiva was concerned with the halacha of Beit Shammai. Normally, hands down, we pass like Beis Hillel against Beit Shammai. So I'm not sure, we sing a song, Tu B'Shvat Higia Chag Le'Ilanot. I'm not sure how Rabbi Akiva sang that song. Or, for example, it says, I think it's in the Ramah, if I'm not mistaken, that we don't say Tachnun on Tu B'Shvat. I don't know what Rabbi Akiva did on Rosh Chodesh. Well, all right, it's Rosh Chodesh anyway, so that's not a good question. But when did Rabbi Akiva celebrate Rosh Hashanah Li'Lanos? Was it on Rosh Chodesh Shvat, on Tu B'Shvat? He would have to be machmer and have 2 parties. Those who follow the Arizal and all the Bali Kabbalah, they have, for Tu B'Shvat, they have a whole reading, the symbolic meaning of all the payros. I don't know when Rabbi Akiva actually had that Seder Tu B'Shvat, Seder Rosh Chodesh Shvat. Why, in general, was Rabbi Akiva concerned about Beit Shammai when we always pass like Beis Hillel? Maybe it was before the Baskel. The Baskel came down and said, Alocha Beis Hillel. Okay. Now we get to Rav Mecharchia. Rav Mecharchia is quoting this sugya of Rabbi Akiva with regard to Rosh Hashanah Lilanos. What is he trying to prove? Shmamina Asu, and I'll fill this in, Asu Beit Shammai Kidivreim. If Beit Shammai did not want to get involved in creating some sort of a dissension against Beis Hillel, then why would Rabbi Akiva worry about the Shita Beit Shammai and be mafresh Maser Ani? Forget about Maser Ani. Lo Asu Beit Shammai Kidivreim. Shmamina Asu. This seems to be a clear-cut proof to the Mandi Omer who holds Asu. So the Gemara answers, it's possible to accept Lo Asu and nevertheless to justify Rabbi Akiva's Chumrah. Rabbi Akiva Gemare istapikle. Gemare means a shmur. He had a transmission of Torah, which he heard from his Rebbeim with regard to this machlokes. Below Yada, but he wasn't sure. Beis Hillel be Echad B'Shvat Omer or B'Chamisha Asar B'Shvat. which of these two, Beis Hillel, Beis Shammai held which of these two dates for Rosh Hashanah le'ilanos? And this was confusing Rabbi Akiva. It was very ambiguous, and it was very possible that Adarab, it was Beis Hillel who set up Rosh Chodesh Shvat as Rosh Hashanah le'ilanos. Or perhaps Beis Hillel held that Chavisha Sar B'Shvat is Rosh Hashanah le'ilanos, since Beis Hillel holds Echad B'Shvat. He says here in the note that his topic, Rabbi Akiva b'das Beis Hillel. Rabbi Akiva was vacillating about Beis Hillel. V'af l'man di Omar asu Beit Shammai k'divreihem. And even according to that man Yomer that says Beit Shammai did pass k'divreihem, but that didn't impact on Rabbi Akiva because Rabbi Akiva was trying to figure out the opinion of Beis Hillel. Now, what is the machlokas here between Beis Hillel and Beit Shammai? I don't see any notes on this. Maybe you have some notes. I'm going to take a stab at it. The question is as follows. We have a group of Rosh Hashanah this, Rosh Hashanah Lilanos, Rosh Hashanah L'Kol Bayola. We have Rosh Hashanah L'Shtaros and L'Malachim. I don't know, all different types and categories of Rosh Hashanah. What's common to all of them is that a month is a unit of time that cannot be broken up into two halves, in which half of a month belongs to the previous year and the second half of the month belongs to the next year. You won't find Rosh Hashanah in the middle of a month. I mean, I happen to have in front of me the Mishnah in Rosh Hashanah, and I'll just read it to you. It says here, Echad ben Nisan, Rosh Hashanah l'Malachim, Echad v'El, Rosh Hashanah l'Maisa Behema, Echad b'Tishrei, Rosh Hashanah l'Shanim, Shvitim, Yovlos, V'Netiyah, Echad b'Shvat, Rosh Hashanah l'Ilan. Beit Shammai, the way we have the gears, so Beit Shammai says Rosh Chodesh Shvat is Rosh Hashanah l'Ilanos, is very consistent with all the other Rosh Hashanah that are mentioned in this Mishnah. And the principle here, which I believe is formulated in Yerushalmi, Ein Chodesh Echad Mischalik L'Shtei Shanim. Beis Hillel, on the other hand, in the case of Rosh Hashanah Lilanos, is willing to split the month into two parts, in which case the first half belongs to last year, and from the 15th of Shvat and on, you're already in the tchum of the new year. And the question I want to raise is, what is Beis Hillel gonna say about Ein Chodesh Echad Mischalek L'Shnei Shanim in the case of Shvat, of Rosh Hashanah Lilanos? So the answer to that question is somewhat complex. I'm going to just oversimplify it. There is no such thing as a new Rosh Hashanah Lilanos according to Beis Hillel. Rosh Hashanah Lilanos is Aleph Tishrei. What is Shvat all about? Shvat is what's called a Gilui Milsa. Gilui Milsa means I have to determine, in this case of a fruit, whether it belongs to pre-Aleph Tishrei or post-Aleph Tishrei. But Rosh Hashanah is Aleph Tishrei. We're not splitting a month into two. What we're doing is we're counting a period of time to determine which rainy season was responsible for the growth of these peros. Was it last year's rainy season belonging to, Tafshin Pei Aleph, or was it Tafshin Pei Beis? Right? Every year has its own rainy season. So when the rains fall, and the moisture gets absorbed under the ground in the roots of the netiyah, of the zera, which rains are responsible for the produce, for the development of this particular fruit. Here's a fruit on the table. Is it last year's rainwater or is it this year's rainwater? And the answer is that we wait a certain amount of time to get into the rainy season, deep into the rainy season. The rainy season starts around Cheshvan. So you have Cheshvan, Kislev, Teves, Shvat. It's already 4 months of rain, or 3.5 months of rain. Once we've gotten most of the rains of the season, now we could say that if the fruit was not ready to be harvested, and it belongs to the previous year before Aleph Tishrei, meaning it couldn't have been produced by these rainy seasons. But if we pass that, that majority of the rainy season, then we could say that it's this year's rainy season that generated the produce that grew, and therefore belongs to the new year. In that sense, Basil could have divided up Shvat in any way he wanted. And he came up with the determination that most of the rains of the rainy season fall by the 15th of Shvat. That was Basil's calculation. Anything that grew before the 15th of Shvat, we assume couldn't have grown adequately from this year's rains, but rather last year's rains, meaning pre-Aleph Tishrei rains, and therefore belongs, in this context, to Meiser Sheni rather than Meiser Oni. That's the Shita of Basil. Now the Gemara is going to raise another objection against the opinion of Lo Asu Kidivrei. Masiv Mar Zutra, we learned in Masechet Sukkah, on Daf Chav Ches, Katan she'eno tzarich le'imo, when the cotton reaches that development where he's independent of his mother, ayav b'sukkah mishum chinuch, we have to train the cotton to eat in the sukkah, and he is mature enough that eno tzarich le'imo. And this is all the opinion of Beis Hillel. Beit Shammai holds that even if the katan is so young that he's tzarich le'imo, he's chayav in sukkah b'din chinuch. Ma'isa v'yolda kaloso shel Shammai hazaken upiches es hamazeva. Beit Shammai were of the opinion that even a newborn infant should be brought into the sukkah. And in order to achieve his goal, when Shammai's daughter-in-law gave birth, and there were coverings over the sukkah, over the schach, that were made of concrete, is piches es hamazev. He removed the tit from the ceiling, v'sichech al gabe amita, and he made sure that there was schach on top of the cradle of this newborn child. Now, from the fact that Beit Shammai did an action here, clearly indicating that his opinion was that this child from birth was included on the chinuch, it means Beit Shammai asu k'divrayim shmamina asu. Now you could have argued that in this case there would be no great dissension or machlokes between Beit Hillel and Beit Shammai. Beit Shammai were organizing the sukkah and training even a newborn infant in the mitzvah of sukkah. But the Gemara goes with another mahal. The Gemara says, you know what? Lo asu Beit Shammai k'divrayim. Hasam, there it's different. Haroeh omer lafushe avir ka'av. When the spectator sees that Beit Shammai chipped away at the tit in order to expose the roof, so they would put schach on top, but they came to another conclusion. Lafushe avir ka'av. It was a hot day, and they needed a cross breeze. They didn't have air conditioning. So it's not nikar that the reason why Beit Shammai was piches as hamaziva was for the sake and the purpose of the mitzvah of sukkah, in order to set up the sukkah. It could be, in the eyes of the spectator, he did it in order to have wind and air coming in on both sides. It was a hot day. And the rule is that if in a machlokes, you could do something which will be interpreted as acceptable according to both opinions, then that's the way to go. We will advocate in favor of that. So piches as hamaziva can be interpreted as something which goes according to every shita. You can't say that yibum will work out with every shita. You're talking about an erva. But to get the child, the infant, into the sukkah, well, what are you doing it for? For the purpose of sukkah? No. I'm doing it to get a cross breeze, to make it more comfortable. And in such a case, there's not going to be any machlokas, because Beit Shammai is not going to object, to piches as hamaziva for the purpose of liyavira ka'avi, lafushe avir ka'avi. And therefore, there won't be what we call nirikishtei Torahs. It looks like there are two different Torahs. Beit Hillel are not encouraging the children to go into the sukkah, and Beit Hillel are. I'm sorry, did I get that wrong? Beit Shammai are encouraging the children to go into, Beit Hillel are not. That would cause contention, but if Beit Shammai are doing it in a way that it can be interpreted as not a sukkah motivation, but rather a health motivation or comfort, but without outside of the context of sukkah, then in that case, everybody would agree that it's allowed. So the asu k'divrayim would only apply, because we're going according to the sheet of lo asu k'divrayim, but asu k'divrayim when it's not clear that it's shtei toros and it's agudos agud. Okay, now we get to a sugya of mikvos. So you'll notice if you have the Masechet, he has an introduction to this sugya, and we know that the shear of a sukkah, the minimum size is 40 sa. If it's missing a mashu of 40 sa, then the following rule applies. He has another mikvah, which is contiguous to this mikvah, The other mikveh has the shear of 40 sa, and he can mix the mayim very easily. Mixing the shtei mikvos together. How does he mix the two mikvos, which are one near the other? He drills a hole in the wall that separates between these two mikvos. And this will integrate the two mikvos in such a way that even if one of those two mikvos did not have Arboim Sa, it's now considered as if it has Arboim Sa. Now, this hole between the two mikvos, that's mechaber, that links the two mikvos and integrates them into one mikvah, so that even the mikvah that's chaser became kosher. How large of a hole is it? Beit Shammai are of the opinion that you need kidei shetipaches dofno beruba. What does that mean, beruba? That most of the width that's common to the two mikvos, the width of the dofen that separates the two mikvos, will be opened up. And Beis Hillel say, no, we could be machshir, even if we have a nekev kigodel shvoferes hagud hanot. Which is equal to shtei etzbos. And the impression you get here is that Beit Shammai are machmirim. They really want to physically change the kosel that separates remove the kosel so that the two mikvos are integrated. And Beis Hillel are looking for some sort of halachic shear that will allow us to paskin, to rule that the two mikvos are one. So therefore, Beis Hillel say you don't have to go so radical and profound as to removing the dofen and rubo shel dofen that separates the two mikvos. All you need is a nekev which is equivalent to the width of a shvoferes hanot. Which, as we said before, is as small as shtei etzbos. Shvoferes is when you take a reed and you hollow it out, it becomes like a straw, so to speak. And a node is a pitcher. So let's say you have a pitcher of water, and you drill a hole where you could put in a shvoferes into the node. And that's the equivalent of the width of 2 fingers. Once you've punctured a hole in the dofen that separates these two mechitzos, Beis Hillel argue, you've in effect connected the two mechitzos. And the water from one mechitza the two mikvahs, I meant to say. And the water from one mikvah goes into the water of the other mikvah, and they mix, and everything is fine. It's one long mikvah. That's Beis Hillel. Masiv Mar Zutra, if you're going to tell me, Lo Asu Beit Shammai K'divrayim, what are you going to do with the story that's recorded in the 4th parak of Masechet Mikvos? Maisa B'shokes Yahu, I don't know who he was. He says, look in Rashi. Question is, just 1 second. Oh, there it is. You see, in the skinny lines of Rashi, if you count up from the wide lines, 1, 2, 3, 4, 7 lines up from the wide lines. Shokes Even Chalula, a hollow stone, Shetachas Sinor, Amalakeach, Amakaleach Mayim Minahor. You've got water, rainwater running down the outside of a mountain. He puts some sort of a pipe to collect that water that's rolling down, flowing down from the side of the mountain. And that was called Shokes Yehu. Very strange name. Just see if he explains what Shokes Yehu. I don't see any historical background to this, but he says that Haisa B'Yushalayim Shokes, Haisa Nikre Shokes Yehu. So this hollowed out stone, which is called the Shokes, was called Shokes Yehu. V'haisa nekuva lemikva. What does this mean? Haisa nekuva lemikva. See Rashi here. Second. Oh, there's the Rashi. Rashi is reading a little bit weiter in the Mishnah in Mikvos, and it says, "Kol tarot shahay b'Yushalayim nasim al gaba." Nasim al gaba, matbilin b'tocha. So you remember we had a hollowed out stone, and the water from the mountain was collecting in this hollow in the stone, but it didn't have harboim so. Aval mikveh sholem haya b'mayim shebetzidah. Misarvim mimayon hashokes derech nekev b'shvoferes hagid. Wow. So let's just again try to get the sense of what's going on here. There are a lot of nuances here. So the Shokes itself did not have harboim so, but Haisa nekuva lemikvah. There's some sort of a mikvah next to the showcase, and they created a hole, and the mikvah had arboim saw, and the hole itself had a shear of shfoferes hanot, which again would be acceptable according to Beit Hillel. They were machshir a mikveh even with a nekev that was only wide enough for a shfoferes hanot. B'chol taro shoyu b'Yerushalayim ayunasim al gava. All the kalim that they had to be matpil in Yerushalayim, they did it in this showcase. V'sholchu Beit Shammai v'chivua. Beit Shammai would not accept the nekev of Kishfoferes Hanod. That wasn't wide enough to be machshir the mikveh that had less than arboim saw the showcase. So they widened the nekev until they were able to chip away at the Evan, at the stone, in a way that there would be a flow of water coming from the next door mikveh, the kosher mikveh, which is right contiguous. And as for what he saw, the water would flow into the showcase. And he writes here in the note, Hirchivu es hanekev u'pirsu es ruba shel dofen hashokes, which is exactly the rove that Beit Shammai needs. Beit Shammai omer shetipochas tipoches beruba shel dofen. So there's a dofen that is common to both mikvot. One mikveh has arboim, so the other doesn't. And if you break down that dofen by most of the size of the dofen, then the waters flow back and forth. You can integrate the two, and you can be matbil kalim even in that shokas that has less than arboim so. But we see clearly that Beit Shammai took the law into their hands, and they actually chipped away at the shokas, breaking it down so the rov dofen was removed. Piches rov dofen. So now we're ready for Marzucha's kasha. Utnan, according to the Mishnah, Basil says, Erev mikfos b'shfoferes hanod, the ovya ubechalola. In other words, the thickness of fanos. All you need is a shfoferes, together with the rochev of this area, and it's kishtei at etzbos. And it's the equivalent to the size of two etzbos. We see that Beit Shammai were not mevatel their das to Beis Hillel, but rather they insisted on taking the law into their hands, doing an action, and breaking it down to rov dofen, such that the two mikvos could integrate into one. The Gemara answers, no, you could always say that lo asu Beit Shammai kedifreim, shiny asam. The case of the shokas was different. Why? On Daf Tezvav and Beis, shaharoa kol haroa es Beit Shammai, when they saw Beit Shammai breaking down this nekev between the shokas and the nearby mikvah, they're not going to think that they were doing it because of their sheet in tefillah and in mikvahs, but rather they're looking for an easy way of getting more water into the shokas. I don't know exactly why, but maybe because there were so many kalim that had to go in there from all of the taras of Yerushalayim, they wanted more water in there because the water level was going down. I don't know. But it's not nirikish toros, it's not agudos, and therefore Beit Shammai took the license to break down. Again, what they were motivated by was halacha, but they wanted to be concerned about agudos agudos, so they needed to be told that what they were doing was motivated by a different reason than the real reason, in order to avoid agudos agudos. And that they could do because the Rov would say, La Fushe Maya Hudakov. I mean, the pattern of the Gemara seems to repeat itself over and over. Now the Gemara is again going to induce a proof that they Shamai Asu Kidivreim. Tashma the Omer Rabbi Elazar Tzadik, Shayisi Lomi Toreitz Rabbi Yochanan Chorani, Ra'isi Shaya Ochel Pascha Reva B'Melach B'Shnei Batzoros. He would eat a dried piece of meat bread, dip it into salt during the difficult drought years. Vasi Volgatius Ava, when I mentioned it to my father of Tzaddik, Amali Avi, my father said to me, Holech lo zeisen. I guess, they felt very empathetic to the situation, the drastic and dire situation of Rabbi Yochanan Achorni, and they wanted to give him zeisen. Volachti lo, and as commanded, Rabbi Elazar brought the zeisim to Rabbi Yochanan. Ra'u osam shehem lach. Rabbi Yochanan saw that the olives were soft. Ra osan shehem lachin amali einani ochel zeisen. Wow. Imagine, Shnasa Batzores, and he's such a machmir, he's not going to eat the zeisen. Why not? So the Masifta writes, Ein hamachol makabel tumachi avil of mashkin. Once a foodstuff is wet, it becomes wet with one of the 7 mashkin, then it is mukhshal makabel tuma. And one of the various machshirim, or the 7 beverages, the 7 liquids, is shemen, is oil. So that the juices of, the natural juices of a fruit are not considered mashkin and not machshirim. Only shemen that comes from zeisen are machshir. And here we have a machlokas between Beis Hillel and Beis Shammai. What kind of shemen is classified as a mashke, to be machshel l'kabel tumah? We have something called moel, which is spelled mem vav hey lam. I don't know the exact English translation, but it means that some of the moisture, the liquids, come out even before you pound on them and press them. So you have zeisim, and a little bit of moel comes out. It reminds me a little bit of tzir in basar. When you cut a piece of meat, sometimes you get that red liquid, which is not dam. Also here, with zeisim, you'll see that the zayis already has almost like a coating on it of oil that came from inside the olive without crushing it. And that's called moel. And what's the status of moel? Is it like all of peiros, meaning it's not a machshir, or does it have a status of shemen, which is one of the 7 mashkin that are machshir? On that is machlokas Beis Hillel Beis Shammai. Moel hayotze min hazeisim kodem dri chasam. Are they considered shemen, and therefore the machshir l'kabel tumah? Odino kimei pero she'ena machshir. So moil is nothing. It's like mei peros. It's like zeya be'alma. Beit Shammai omrim eno machshir. Beit Hillel omrim shu machshir. Now, these zaysim were delivered to Rabbi Yochanan HaCharni in an earthenware pot, which is called a chavish al cheres. And Rabbi Yochanan was worried about the possibility that an Amoritz might have touched the outside of this chavish al cheres, and that would engender tumah b'drabanan. Chazra chavis v'tima es hazeisim. Since the outside of the cheres was contaminated by an amoritz, therefore, once the chavis is tameh, then it automatically is metame the contents of the chavis, namely the zaysim. And this reflects the Shita Beis Hillel that moel is already considered a machshir. So that even before the zaysim were actually sent to the press for dricha, the zaysim are muksharim lekabel tumah because of the moel. That is the opinion of Beis Hillel. Now Rabbi Elazar goes on to tell us more of the story. Basi bodati is Abba. Now I relayed back to my father, Rabbi Tzadok, that Rabbi Yochanan declined. He would not eat the olives. Amali lechem marlo chavis nekuva haisa. Now we're going to have to analyze what's the significance of nekuva haisa. In other words, it was perforated. There were holes on the bottom of this barrel. Meaning, notify Rabbi Yochanan that he doesn't have to worry and be concerned based on the Shita Beis Hillel that there's moel, that's machshir the zaysim lekabel tumah, when the amoritz touches the outside of the kli cheres. There's no need to worry. Tell him that this chavis is nekuva, which would naturally mean that the moel would drop through the holes, the perforated pot. Ela shestamua shmarim. So there are sediments, and they clog up these holes. He says, "Umishum kach nishar b'socha moel v'lichlech es hazeisim v'kavana tchila ninkeva chavis k'dei sheyazuv hamoel mimeno v'yetzel achutz." So they deliberately perforated the bottom of this chavis so that the moel that comes out of the zaysim would go down the holes. Lefichach ein lo l'Rabbi Yochanan lachshosha hukshu hazaysim b'moel zeh lekabolas tumah shrei b'kach shenike bal hazaysim es hachavis gila daito shelo nichalo Now, apparently, there's halacha of gili das, meaning when you have peros that come in contact with liquids, and those liquids, if they belong to the 7 categories, are machshir, that's only if you're interested and you have some benefit from the fact that the liquids wet the peros. But here in this case, there was a gili das from the fact that he deliberately made these holes so that the moil should go out, that he has no interest whatsoever in accumulating the moil for any reason. And therefore, they are not machshir the zaysim lekabel tumah. You have nothing to worry about. Even in the worst case scenario, that the outside of the klicheres came in contact with an amoretz, the zaysim are not going to be makabel tumah because there was no das for the liquid to wet the peros. The Eina Mashkim Machshirin Lekabolas Tumel and Kain Nitnu Al Gavia Ochel Lerotzan Abaylim. The Bailim get some benefit from it. They're happy about the fact that the fruits are wet. Nimtza Shein Shum Chashash Tumah B'Seisim Elu. The af im nitva chavos ayidei magim amoris lo nitva zeis mishlo hufshul kabolas tuma utnan. And we have a mission in Masechet Yevamot fourth parak chavos shel zeisim migulgolim. What is migulgolim? Dechukim v'omdim b'chavos. So he packs up the chavos with zeisim. Beit Shammai omrim ein tzricha linoket. Even if this chavos is not perforated, it's perfectly hermetically sealed. There's Beit Shammai. We don't have to worry about the moel. The moel is not considered shemen. It's not one of the 7 mashkim that are machshirin. And therefore, in this case, the zaysim would not become muksharim lekabel tumah. Moel is like any meiperos. It is insignificant. It doesn't have the shem shemen. It doesn't have the status of shemen. It cannot serve as one of the machshirim. Beisil omrim tzricha linoket. Beisil hold that moel is considered like shemen, even though it didn't come out through dricha. And therefore, you need a nekev in the chavos in order to be megala das that you're not interested in the moel, because otherwise the moel it has the status of shemen of a machshir, and it's machshir the peros to be makabel tumah. Umodid Beis Hillel concede she'im nikva ustamua. Because in the case of Stamua, as we said before, he's megaladas, that he's not interested in collecting the moil. But just one second. If he clogs up the hole, no, first he pierced the holes and then he clogged them up. And we go basar tchilas machavto. Since he started by making nekavim, he's already megaladas that the moel is not mirtzono. He has no interest at all in the moel and accumulating the moel. And therefore, even though Basil says normally moel is shemen, it is a machshir, but here it's not a machshir. Even if later on he was so same through the shmarim, right? The sediments we said would plug up the holes, but it doesn't matter. He wasn't interested in the moel falling on top of the zayis. And finally, says Rabbi Elazar Tzaddik, the afal pi, the Talmud Shammai hoya. Rabbi Yochanan was a Talmud of Shammai, And according to Beit Shammai, you don't need Nikivas HaChavis because the oil is not Shemen, it's Shar Peros, it's not Machshel Kabul Tumah. Nevertheless, Rabbi Yochanan, even though he was a Talmud of Beit Shammai, he was Choshesh for the Shita Beis Hillel. He would not eat from the Zaysim until they notified him that they deliberately made a nekev in the Chavis. We derive from this the conclusion that Kol Maisav Lo Asa Ela K'divrei Beis Hillel. Even though he's a Talmud of Beit Shammai. You want to tell me a chiddush here in the fact that Rabbi Yochanan did a Maisa like Beis Hillel? That makes sense if Asu Beis Shammai K'divreim. Is Haina Rabusa, namely that even though Rabbi Yochanan belonged to the school and was a Talmud of Beit Shammai, and even though they were implementing in the Beit Shammai household and school the halacha of Beit Shammai, so we're holding now that Asu K'divreim is nevertheless, Afal Pichen Rabbi Yochanan was machmir here in this case like Beis Hillel, and he wouldn't eat from the Zaysim until they convinced him that even Beis Hillel would eat from the Zaysim because they made the Nekavim, and that was a Gili Das that they weren't interested in the Moed. But if you're going to tell me that Beis Shammai and all the Talmidim Beit Shammai would never want to cross swords with the Psak, the ruling of Beis Hillel, and they always implemented Allah like Beis Hillel, V'lo asu k'divrayim is my Rabusa, why do you have to tell me that Rabbi Yochanan was only calmed down about eating the Zaysim when they told him that there was a Nekev, and therefore they were not interested in the Moel, and that's a Gili Das, and Allah is like Beis Hillel? What's the Chiddush over here? We always are knowing like Beis Shammai, like Beis Hillel, because Lo Asu K'divrayim. So what are you telling me? A big Chiddush that Rabbi Yochanan would not eat the Zaysim until you calmed it down, that even Beis Hillel would eat the Zaysim, and they were considered Tahoros. This would only make sense if Asu Beit Shammai K'divrayim. And now we have a great chiddush that even amongst the Talmidim Beit Shammai, who would Asu K'divrei Beit Shammai, there was some Talmidim, one of them is Rabbi Yochanan, who would desist from implementing Beit Shammai's psak, and he wouldn't be calm unless Beis Hillel would accept that psak in the situation of the covenant. So this is a further proof that Beit Shammai Asu K'divrei. So let's just review very quickly what we saw. We had the case of two mikvahs, one of which was less than a shear of 40 sa, and we defended the shita that Asu K'divrei by saying that here, just 1 second. Let me just go over it. Lo Asu K'divrei. Right. Here we defended the shita of Lo Asu K'divrei. Now, in the case of Rabbi Yochanan, we bring a raya that Beit Shammai Asu K'divrei. It's very interesting. We had a raya that Beit Shammai Asu K'divrei from the case of Shokes. But we rejected that raya because the onlooker would say that Lafushe Maya Hudaka Avid. And we had a similar dechia in the case of the infant, and Beit Shammai was, chipping away at the tit that covered the sukkah, that would passel the sukkah, but they're also lafushi avir covered. So we never actually proved, neither from sukkah nor from Erev Mikvos, meaning from Hilchos Mikvos, that Beit Shammai Asu K'divrei, because it could be that those were exceptions to the rule rather than the rule,
because they could justify it in the eyes of the spectator, even according to Beis Hillel. So they could square with Beis Hillel, but in general, maybe law Asu Kidivreim. But now we have a clear-cut proof from the story of Zaysim and Hechshel Kabul Tuma, as far as the status of Moel is concerned. In the case of Nekev, we see clearly that Beit Shammai Asu Kidivreim. So at this point, again, we'll pick this up tomorrow, but the Gemara seems to come to the final conclusion that Beit Shammai Asu Kidivreim. So let's just make a note. We're up to Tashma, and that is the question that Rabbi Yeshua asked, and we get back to the sugya of Tzoras Hamas, Tzoras Erev. Okay then? So I wish you a great day.